Duan Lingtian walked towards the Divine Might Marquis estate after leaving his own courtyard house. He didn't forget what the servant girl had said to him earlier. "Father left something behind for me with Uncle Nai." Under his curiosity, Duan Lingtian arrived at the Divine Might Marquis estate. Even though the guards before the entrance of the Divine Might Marquis estate were unfamiliar faces, after Duan Lingtian indicated his identity and they found some senior guards to prove it, they respectfully and reverently greeted Duan Lingtian in. "You can get back to your duties, I'll go find Uncle Nai myself." When he saw the audience hall was completely empty, Duan Lingtian spoke out to the guard that let him in before heading alone towards the courtyard where the Divine Might Marquis, Nai Yuan, lived. When he just arrived outside the courtyard, Duan Lingtian heard familiar voices coming from within. But this voice was slightly low and heavy at this moment. "Father, if worst comes to worst, just ask Mother to not be that sex leader. She's already old, it's just nice for her to return and enjoy the happiness of leisure and spend time with her grandson." Duan Lingtian was able to discern that this was exactly the voice of his Uncle Nai. Uncle Nai seems to be extremely angry. Duan Lingtian's brows raised as he pondered about what Nai Yuan said. Uncle Nai's mother is a sex leader? Could it be that the sect she's from is a sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom? Even though Duan Lingtian had never met Nai Yuan's mother, but he'd heard of her. All those years ago when he'd just arrived at the imperial city of the Crimson Sky Kingdom and arrived at the Divine Might Marquis estate for the first time, he'd come for the sake of curing the Dark Nether Mink's poison for the senior Marquis. Before the poison was cured, Duan Lingtian had heard the senior Marquis mention that the reason he'd been infected with the poison of the Dark Nether Mink was for the sake of obtaining a spirit fruit guarded by the Dark Nether Mink, whereas, that spirit fruit was something his wife, the mother of the Divine Might Marquis, Nai Yuan, required. If she was unable to obtain the spirit fruit, then his wife would be in great trouble. At that time, Duan Lingtian knew that the wife of the senior Marquis was still alive, but she wasn't in the Crimson Sky Kingdom. When he heard Nai Yuan now, he guessed that Nai Yuan's mother ought to be the sect leader of a sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom or another imperial kingdom. As for an empire or the Darkhan dynasty, Duan Lingtian didn't dare imagine it, as it wasn't realistic. Grandson? Big brother Nai has gotten married. Besides that, Duan Lingtian caught another piece of information from Nai Yuan's words, and his gaze couldn't help but light up. Right at this moment, another aged voice sounded out. "I've told your mother about this, and she's willing to discharge her responsibilities. But those old fellows have instead said that if she really wants to leave the sect, then she must have her cultivation crippled. Not only that, She even has to pass through the most severe trials in order to leave the section. Duan Lingtian was able to discern that this was the voice of the senior marquis. Bang! Practically the instant the senior marquis finished speaking, an enormous bang sounded out from within the courtyard, and Duan Lingtian was able to see through a small window on the wall that Nai Yuan had smashed apart the stone table. They're going too far. At that time when Mother had just taken over the position of patriarch, those old fellows had always been looking for trouble with Mother. They only restrained themselves slightly after Mother consumed the spirit fruit and her cultivation improved greatly. This time, Mother was injured for the sake of the sake, and not only are they not grateful, they're instead forcing Mother to step down. They're truly damnable. Nai Yuan was extremely enraged. Grandpa Nai, Uncle Nai. Duan Lingtian walked over to the courtyard with large strides as he lightly smiled and greeted them. Little Tian? When did you return? The two people in the courtyard were first stunned when they heard Duan Lingtian's voice. Nai Yuan was the first to react, and he revealed a pleasantly surprised expression as he greeted Duan Lingtian in. At this moment, he didn't have the slightest enraged appearance from before. Of course, Duan Lingtian was able to discern that even though Nai Yun was happy because he'd returned, the depths of Nai Yuan's eyes still contained rage that was impossible to restrain. I've just returned and heard the servant girls say that my father has gone on a long trip, and he'd placed some things with Uncle Nai, so I came over. Duan Lingtian smiled. Kid. If your father didn't put some things with me, would you not think of coming to see Uncle Nai? Nai Yuan derided, yet an amiable expression suffused his face. Of course not. Duan Lingtian hurriedly shook his head. Take it. This is the spatial ring your father asked me to pass to you before he left. With a raise of his hand, Nai Yuan passed a spatial ring to Duan Lingtian. Duan Lingtian put away the spatial ring and didn't examine it closely for now, and he instead looked at the nearby Nai Yuan and the old man. Uncle Nai, Grandpa Nai. You two seem to have encountered some trouble. Little Tian, you rarely return, you don't have to worry about matters. The senior marquis was kind and amiable as before. Grandpa Nai. Duan Lingtian's expression turned solemn as he spoke seriously. In my eyes, you and Uncle Nai are my loved ones, and when a loved one faces problems, I naturally can't stand idly by. Unless both of you take me to be an outsider. Alas, how could we take you to be an outsider? It's truly because that this matter is too troublesome, and it isn't something you can deal with. The senior marquis sighed. Yeah, little Tian, don't bother about this matter. Nai Yuan said as well, you rarely return, and you ought to be happy. Don't let your mood be affected by other things. Uncle Nai, Grandpa Nai, just tell me. Perhaps I'll be able to help. Duan Ling Tian persisted. The pair of father and son glanced at each other and nodded when they saw Duan Ling Tian persisting like this, and they started telling the sequence of events to Duan Ling Tian. In next to no time, Duan Ling Tian obtained a certain level of understanding towards this matter. It turned out that Nai Yuan's mother was a disciple of a second-rate sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom in the past. She became acquainted with the senior Marquis while she was young and married the senior Marquis, who was still the Divine Might Marquis at that time. Moreover, they had a son together, Nai Yuan. Because of her extremely good natural talent in the martial Dao, Nai Yuan's mother had always been looked highly upon by the previous sect leader of that sect, and the sect leader even took her to be the next inheritor of the position of sect leader. It was to the point that the sect leader even didn't fuss about her privately becoming married and having kids outside of the sect. That sect had an unwritten rule. Without exception, the person that was the sect leader or inheritor of the position of sect leader had to sever all emotional ties and was disallowed to marry and have children. Because only in that way could they guarantee that the sect leader would selflessly offer their entire lives to the sect. What a **T rule. Duan Ling Tian couldn't help but curse in his heart when he heard this rule, as he felt that rubbish sect was truly too selfish to the point of wanting to destroy a person's life for the sake of an unwritten rule. A life without a companion and without children was undoubtedly an incomplete life. In next to no time, along with the death of the old sect leader, Nai Yuan's mother had become the sect master, whereas the older generation higher UPS that couldn't bear the sight of her had instead made things difficult for her at every corner. At that time, the senior Marquis had been inflicted by the poison of the dark nether mink for the sake of a spirit fruit, and it was precisely because he wanted to obtain that spirit fruit to assist his wife in improving her cultivation. After his wife consumed the spirit fruit, her strength rose greatly, and it allowed her to suppress the group of higher UPS of the older generations. From that day onwards, everything had become much calmer. It was even to the extent that those old fellows didn't dare say anything even when the senior Marquis went to stay at the sect for a long time. The reason Duan Ling Tian didn't see the senior Marquis when he returned the last time was because the senior Marquis was staying with his wife and keeping her company. Half a year ago, that sect came into conflict with another sect, and Nai Yuan's mother had suffered an injury during the conflict, causing her strength to drop greatly. Meanwhile, those higher UPS of the older generation came out once more to oppress her. When Nai Yuan's mother thought about how she'd given up half her life to the sect yet received such repayment, she felt more displeased the more she thought about it, and coupled with the fact her grandson had already gotten married and had children, she decided to step down and leave the internal struggles of the sect. But those higher UPS of the sect didn't allow it instead, and they deliberately wanted her to stay within the forbidden area of the sect and be the sect guardian. Unless the sect encountered danger, otherwise, she wasn't allowed to leave the forbidden area. Of course, she could choose to leave the sect. But there were two conditions. 1. Her cultivation would be crippled. 2. After her cultivation was crippled, she had to pass through the most severe trials before being able to leave the sect. What are these severe trials? Duan Ling Tian asked curiously. Na Yuan had a gloomy expression as he said, "It's an extremely harsh test that only a person that had committed a great crime had to pass through after having their cultivation was crippled. Since the existence of that sect, there hasn't been a single person who had their cultivation crippled who was able to pass through the test. Those old fellows want to make my mother go to her death." As he finished speaking, Na Yuan's eyes were completely crimson red. Even though he was the divine might marquis of the Crimson Sky Kingdom, a person that was only below the emperor and above all, yet he was unable to affect the sect his mother belonged to. "Grandpa Nai, Uncle Nai. I'll make a trip there with the two of you." After he found out about the sequence of events, Duan Ling Tian spoke out to the two of them. Duan Ling Tian's words caused both of them to be stunned, and then they shook their heads at the same time. "No. This matter isn't something you can deal with." "Yes, little Tian. Even though your natural talent isn't bad, only a few years have passed. At most, you've only just broken through to the void prying stage not too long ago. No matter how inferior that sect is, it's still a second-rate sect, and there's no lack of existences at the 7th level of the void prying stage there," said Na Yuan. Even though he knew Duan Ling Tian's natural talent in the martial Dao was heaven-defying, as far as he was concerned, only a short few years had passed, and it was utterly impossible for Duan Ling Tian to possess a cultivation at the 7th level of the void prying stage or above. Second-rate sect. Duan Ling Tian's brows raised as he muttered to himself. According to his understanding of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, a second-rate sect ought to be a sect at the same level at the boundless sect that Xiongquan was from. A second-rate sect didn't possess a martial artist at the void initiation stage. A sect like this was really nothing to the current Duan Ling Tian. After all, he stood at a different height. "Uncle Nai, Grandpa Nai, do the two of you believe in me?" When Duan Ling Tian saw the two of them were unwilling to allow him to lend a hand no matter what, his face sank as he asked with a solemn voice. "In the end, both of them were helpless and could only go along with Duan Ling Tian. I'll take saving Grandma this time as a present to that little nephew of mine that I've never seen. Duan Ling Tian thought in his heart. He didn't even have the time to go see Naifen and Naifeng's child when he visited the Divine Might Marquis estate this time before hurriedly leaving with Nai Yuan and the senior Marquis, Nai Rong. After he left the Divine Might Marquis estate, Duan Ling Tian returned to his own courtyard house, and he notified Feng Wu Dao's group of 3 before gathering with Nai Rong and Nai Yuan and leaving the imperial city of the Crimson Sky Kingdom.